Before you dismiss what you have been feeling as stress, exhaustion, or simple overthinking, there is something you need to know. A powerful shift is already moving through your emotional world, and whether you recognize it or not, it has already begun touching parts of your heart you thought were buried long ago. This is not ordinary energy. This is not one of those passing astrological moments that drifts through unnoticed. What is approaching carries the force of a turning point. It does not wait for permission. It does not politely announce its arrival. It enters your life with enough intensity to rearrange feelings you believed were settled and awaken emotions you thought had disappeared forever. Within less than 48 hours, Venus and Chiron will form an exact square at the final degree of two cardinal signs. This is a configuration that has attracted extraordinary attention among astrologers because of the emotional pressure concentrated within it. Some have described it as one of the most significant emotional signatures of the entire decade. Yet while countless people will experience its effects, very few will understand what is actually happening beneath the surface. They will notice the restlessness. They will feel the ache. They will sense something shifting inside them. But they may never connect those experiences to the sky above them. You, however, may already be noticing the signals. Perhaps there has been a strange heaviness sitting quietly in your chest, not tied to a specific person, not attached to a clear memory, just a feeling that seems to appear from nowhere and linger longer than it should. Maybe you have found yourself thinking about love in ways you have not for a very long time. Maybe there is a longing that feels older than your current circumstances, almost as if your soul is remembering something your mind cannot fully identify. The sensation may be subtle, but it is growing stronger. Hour by hour, day by day, something is pulling your attention inward. For some of you, the experience has been even more noticeable. Tears arrive unexpectedly. Emotions surface without warning. A song, a random conversation, or even a quiet moment alone becomes enough to trigger feelings that seem completely disconnected from the present moment. You may have searched for a logical explanation and found none. That is because the source of what you are experiencing reaches much deeper than ordinary circumstances. There is a specific reason these emotional waves are appearing now, and understanding that reason changes everything. The biggest mistake you could make is assuming this energy does not matter. Ignoring it would be like ignoring a signal light on the dashboard of your soul. Because what is unfolding is not random emotional turbulence. It is part of a larger process that has been building for days. Once you understand the sequence of events that led to this moment, the confusion begins to dissolve. The emotional intensity starts making sense. The vulnerability starts making sense. Even the unexpected memories and feelings begin fitting together like pieces of a puzzle that has been scattered for years. The story actually began several days earlier. The square arriving on June 13th is not appearing out of nowhere. The groundwork was already laid earlier in the week through an event that carried an entirely different emotional tone. On June 9th, Venus formed an exact conjunction with Jupiter at 25 degrees Cancer. This alignment brought together the planet associated with love and connection and the planet associated with growth, abundance, possibility, and hope. The meeting occurred in Cancer, a sign deeply connected to emotional safety, belonging, nurturing, and the desire to feel protected. The importance of this conjunction cannot be overstated because Jupiter is exalted in Cancer. In astrological terms, this means Jupiter functions at its highest expression while traveling through this sign. Its ability to magnify blessings, expand emotional awareness, and increase feelings of optimism becomes extraordinarily powerful. When Venus joined Jupiter at this degree, many people experienced an opening in the heart without fully realizing it. Perhaps you felt unusually hopeful about the future. Perhaps a relationship suddenly seemed full of possibility again. Perhaps you found yourself craving a level of emotional intimacy that had been absent from your life for a long time. Some people experienced it as a desire to build something real. Others felt a deep yearning for emotional security, for connection, for the feeling of being understood. A simple act of kindness may have affected you more deeply than expected. Words that normally would have bounced off your defenses somehow reached places inside you that had been protected for years. That softening was not accidental. It was part of the process. The conjunction between Venus and Jupiter expanded your capacity to feel. It stretched the emotional boundaries you had constructed through disappointment, heartbreak, fear, and self-protection. For a brief moment, the armor became lighter. The walls became thinner. The guarded parts of your heart stepped forward. And here is why that matters. Healing cannot occur in places that remain completely hidden. A wound cannot be transformed if it stays locked away in darkness. The universe first had to expand your emotional awareness before it could reveal what still needed attention. Venus and Jupiter created the opening. They encouraged trust. They encouraged hope. They reminded you that love was still possible. They reminded you that vulnerability was not weakness. Now the next stage begins. Only 4 days later, the Venus-Chiron Square arrives, and it does not arrive to punish you. It arrives to illuminate something unfinished. The exact place that became exposed during the Venus-Jupiter conjunction becomes the focus of attention. The area of your emotional life that has quietly carried pain, disappointment, rejection, abandonment, or grief now moves into the spotlight. Think of it less as suffering and more as precision. Less as destruction and more as healing, work that requires extraordinary accuracy. The heart was opened first because the deeper wound could not be reached any other way. What happens next is deliberate. It is targeted. It is designed to reveal what has remained hidden beneath years of coping mechanisms and emotional survival strategies. Then comes June 13th. At 1:20 in the morning, Venus, positioned at 29 degrees Cancer, forms an exact 90-degree square, with Chiron positioned at 29 degrees Aries. And this detail is critically important because this is not an ordinary square. Both celestial bodies occupy the 29th degree of their respective signs. Astrologers refer to this placement as the anaretic degree, often called the degree of fate. It represents the final stage of a lesson, the moment when accumulated pressure reaches its peak and demands resolution. When planets occupy the 29th degree, their messages become impossible to ignore. The energy no longer arrives quietly. It carries the full weight of everything that sign has been attempting to teach. Years of emotional patterns, fears, desires, and unfinished lessons become compressed into a single point of extraordinary intensity. It is the final chapter before a transition, the final examination before graduation, the moment when everything hidden beneath the surface rises because it can no longer remain concealed. And as this energy reaches its exact peak, what emerges from within may become the very thing that finally changes the direction of your emotional journey forever. Now consider what happens when Venus reaches the final possible degree of Cancer. Think carefully about what Cancer represents. It governs emotional security, belonging, family bonds, childhood conditioning, and that deeply human desire to feel protected by the people we love. When Venus arrives at the very edge of this sign, standing at its last possible moment before crossing into something new, it acts like a spotlight shining into every corner of the heart. Suddenly, questions that have been sitting quietly beneath the surface refuse to remain hidden. Every unresolved experience connected to love, acceptance, safety, and self-worth begins demanding attention. Not slowly, not one layer at a time. Everything arrives together, creating a wave that can feel overwhelming if you do not understand what is happening. Across the sky sits Chiron at the final degree of Aries. Chiron, often called the wounded healer, has been traveling through Aries since 2018. For nearly 8 years, humanity has been participating in a collective lesson centered around identity. Aries governs the self. It governs personal existence, individual desire, autonomy, and the right to take up space in the world. Throughout this long transit, people have been challenged to confront questions many spend a lifetime avoiding. Am I worthy of being seen? Do my needs matter? Am I allowed to pursue what I truly want? Is there something fundamentally wrong with me, or have I simply been carrying beliefs that never belonged to me in the first place? This is why the square forming on June 13th carries so much weight. Chiron is approaching the end of a chapter that has been unfolding for almost a decade. The lessons associated with this placement have been building pressure year after year. The fears, insecurities, and identity wounds exposed during this period have all been leading toward a final moment of recognition. A closing scene. A graduation point. A threshold where the soul is asked to decide whether it will continue carrying an old story or finally release it. And now Venus enters that story. Venus approaches the wound directly, not as an enemy, not as a punishment, not as a force of suffering. Venus arrives carrying the themes of love, connection, affection, and emotional truth. It reaches toward the place that has been hurting for years and illuminates it. The purpose is not to create more pain. The purpose is to reveal what can no longer remain hidden. Sometimes healing begins not when a wound disappears, but when it is finally seen clearly enough to stop controlling your life from the shadows. Because of this, the emotional atmosphere surrounding June 13th may feel unusually intense. Not the kind of intensity associated with excitement, ambition, or confidence. This is a different experience entirely. It can feel vulnerable. It can feel uncomfortable. It can feel as though layers of emotional protection are being removed faster than expected. Many people may find themselves reacting more strongly than usual without understanding why. Imagine carrying armor for years without realizing how heavy it has become. Then suddenly, someone removes it. At first there is relief. Then comes exposure. Air touches places that have not been touched in a very long time. That is the type of emotional environment this transit can create. For some individuals, conflict may suddenly feel much more personal than it normally would. Minor disagreements may trigger reactions that seem disproportionate to the situation itself. A disappointed tone in someone's voice, a cancelled plan, a brief misunderstanding, an offhand remark from a stranger. Things that would ordinarily pass through your awareness without leaving much impact may suddenly reach deeper emotional layers. This does not happen because you have become weaker. It happens because the protective filters you normally rely on are temporarily thinner. The heart is more exposed, and that exposure serves a purpose. Others may notice a powerful wave of self-doubt emerging unexpectedly, not ordinary insecurity, something deeper, a feeling that questions your lovability at its core. A belief that relationships work for everyone else but somehow remain out of reach for you. A fear that there is a flaw hidden inside you that prevents genuine connection from lasting. These thoughts can feel convincing in the moment, which is exactly why awareness is so important. What speaks during this transit is often the voice of the wound itself. Old pain has a remarkable ability to disguise itself as truth. Yet the fact that a feeling appears does not automatically make it accurate. At the same time, memories may begin resurfacing from places you thought were long forgotten. Not the experiences you have already examined and understood. Not the stories you have already made peace with. The memories that tend to emerge now are often the ones buried beneath years of distraction and adaptation. Early experiences that shaped your understanding of love. Moments when affection felt conditional. Times when emotional needs were ignored, dismissed, or misunderstood. The first experiences that taught you it might be safer to suppress your desires than express them openly. When these memories appear, it can be tempting to view them as setbacks. In reality, they may be surfacing because they are finally ready to leave. The universe is not reopening old doors simply to make you suffer. This particular alignment brings these themes forward because it represents a final opportunity to address them at this specific frequency. What has remained unfinished now seeks completion. There is another dynamic that deserves special attention. During powerful Chiron activations, people often feel an unexpected attraction toward familiar emotional patterns. Old relationship dynamics may suddenly seem appealing again. Familiar wounds may disguise themselves as opportunities. There can be an almost magnetic pull toward people who embody lessons you've already lived through many times before. The reason this happens is surprisingly simple. Deep within the psyche exists a belief that if the original scenario can finally be corrected, then the original pain will disappear. Part of the mind imagines that returning to the same emotional landscape will somehow produce a different ending. Yet true healing rarely arrives through repeating the wound. More often, it arrives through recognizing the pattern clearly enough to choose a different path. And now we arrive at something many of you have already been experiencing. Earlier, I mentioned the unexplained emotional releases occurring for so many people. The tears that seem to arrive without context. The sudden waves of feeling that appear disconnected from any specific event. The moments when emotion rises so strongly that it feels impossible to explain. This is where everything begins to connect. The Venus-Jupiter conjunction on June 9th did far more than inspire optimism or increase emotional openness. It reached into deeper layers of the human experience, into the nervous system, into emotional memory, into places where grief, disappointment, heartbreak, and unmet longing are stored not as thoughts, but as sensations. Long before the conscious mind understands what is happening, the body often begins the process of release. That is why some emotions seem to arrive without a story attached to them. There may be no clear memory, no obvious trigger, no single event you can point to as the cause. What is moving through you may have been stored for years, in some cases for decades. Emotional weight accumulated through countless experiences, quietly carried beneath awareness, until conditions became safe enough for it to emerge. Many healing traditions describe this process as a purge, not because something is wrong, but because something is leaving. The system begins clearing space. The heart begins releasing burdens it no longer needs to carry. The emotional body begins preparing itself for the next stage of transformation. And as this process continues to unfold, what comes next may reveal why everything you have been feeling recently has been leading toward this exact moment. If emotions have been flowing through you lately in ways that seem impossible to explain, stop treating them like a problem that needs to be solved. The tears that arrive without warning are not evidence of weakness. They are not proof that you are falling apart. In many ways, they are evidence that something inside you is finally willing to loosen its grip. What is happening now is not collapse. It is release. Your heart is creating room for a new chapter, and that process does not always arrive wrapped in comfort. Sometimes it arrives as emotion. Sometimes it arrives as exhaustion. Sometimes it arrives as waves of feeling that make no logical sense to the mind, but make perfect sense to the soul. The reason this matters is because the energy waiting on the other side of the Venus-Chiron Square requires space to enter. Something new cannot fully arrive, while old grief continues occupying every room inside you. The emotional clearing taking place now is part of the preparation. Whether your conscious mind understands it or not, your deeper self is already participating in the process. This is why fighting your emotions may actually create more resistance. The more you attempt to control every feeling, analyze every reaction, or force yourself back into emotional numbness, the harder the experience becomes. There are moments in life when healing is not an intellectual exercise, it is an act of surrender. a willingness to allow something to move through you without immediately demanding an explanation. If you've been feeling unusually emotional, trust that there is wisdom inside the experience. Let it move. Let it speak. Let it reveal what it came to reveal. To understand how to navigate an alignment as powerful as this one, it helps to look at a lesson humanity has preserved for centuries. In Japan, there is a traditional art form known as Kintsugi. When a treasured ceramic vessel breaks, the goal is not to disguise the damage. The cracks are not hidden. The fractures are not treated as evidence of failure. Instead, each broken line is carefully repaired using gold. The very places where the object shattered become the most valuable parts of its story. The repaired piece often becomes more beautiful than it was before it broke. There is something profoundly important about that symbolism because it mirrors exactly what this Venus-Chiron Square is asking from you. This transit is not demanding perfection. It is not asking you to erase your history. It is not asking you to pretend painful experiences never happened. It is inviting you to stop treating your wounds as evidence that something is wrong with you. It is encouraging you to approach the vulnerable parts of yourself with compassion instead of judgment. Think about the places you usually avoid, the memories that still make your chest tighten, the disappointments that taught you to become cautious, the experiences that convinced you to build walls around your heart, the parts of yourself that still carry shame. These are not the areas that need punishment, they are the areas that need gold. The first lesson hidden within this process is understanding that scars are not proof of destruction. A scar tells a completely different story. It tells the story of survival. It tells the story of something that endured difficulty and continued forward anyway. Every heartbreak you have experienced, every disappointment, every moment when trust was broken, none of those experiences prove that you are damaged beyond repair. They prove that you are brave enough to care, brave enough to connect, brave enough to open your heart despite the risks. That kind of courage is far rarer than most people realize. The second lesson is refusing to waste suffering. Pain always attempts to teach something. Sometimes the lesson is about boundaries. Sometimes it is about self-respect. Sometimes it is about recognizing patterns that no longer serve you. Every relationship that ended carried information. Every betrayal revealed something. Every moment that left you feeling rejected was quietly developing deeper emotional understanding within you. The challenge is that many people direct that understanding toward everyone except themselves. They become compassionate toward others while remaining cruel toward themselves. They become forgiving toward everyone else's wounds while continuing to judge their own. Yet the wisdom created by those difficult experiences reaches its highest expression only when it finally turns inward. The moment you begin offering yourself the same empathy you offer everyone else, something remarkable begins to change. The third lesson is acceptance. Not surrender in the sense of giving up, not resignation, something far more powerful. Acceptance means recognizing reality without trying to force it into a different shape. It means understanding that people change. Circumstances evolve. Relationships begin and end. Hearts break. Seasons close. Life continues moving, whether we are ready or not. For many people, emotional suffering intensifies because they cling to a version of safety that never truly existed. They attempt to preserve certainty in a world that cannot provide it. They hold tightly to old emotional shells, believing those structures will protect them. But shells create a strange paradox. They may keep pain outside, but they also keep love outside. They may provide temporary protection, but they prevent genuine connection. Eventually, every shell becomes a prison. The gold that repairs the cracks is not found outside of you. It is your awareness, your willingness to remain present, your willingness to stay with yourself during uncomfortable emotions instead of abandoning yourself the moment pain appears. Healing happens when you choose presence over avoidance. It happens when you stop running from your own experience. And then something extraordinary happens. The cosmic sequence shifts almost immediately. At 1:20 in the morning on June 13th, the Venus-Chiron Square reaches its exact peak. The emotional lesson arrives. The wound becomes visible. The opportunity for healing emerges. Then only 5 hours later, at 6:50 in the morning, Venus completes one chapter and begins another. Venus leaves Cancer. Venus enters Leo. This transition happens remarkably fast. One moment, Venus is moving through the deeply emotional waters of Cancer, a realm associated with vulnerability, memory, protection, and emotional sensitivity. Then suddenly the atmosphere changes completely. Fire replaces water. Expression replaces retreat. Visibility replaces hiding. Leo carries an entirely different message. Leo is the sign of the heart expressed openly. It is the sign of creative courage. It is the sign that says, I know who I am, and I am no longer afraid to be seen. After the emotional excavation of Cancer, Venus entering Leo introduces a new phase centered around confidence, authenticity, and self-expression. The symbolism is powerful. First, the wound is revealed. Then the heart is asked to step forward anyway. Venus in Leo encourages people to love boldly rather than cautiously, to express themselves rather than conceal themselves, to radiate instead of shrink. But here is where the story becomes especially important. The experience of Venus in Leo depends entirely upon what happened during the Chiron Square. If you allowed yourself to engage honestly with the healing process, if you faced uncomfortable truths, if you sat with difficult emotions and learned from them, then Leo becomes an extraordinary source of strength. Confidence begins emerging naturally because it is built upon self-knowledge rather than performance. You know what you survived. You know what you confronted. You know what you overcame. That kind of confidence cannot be taken away by outside opinions. However, there is another possibility. If the emotional work is avoided, if the wound is ignored, if blame replaces reflection, if distractions replace healing, then the same Leo energy can express itself differently. The need for validation becomes stronger. Attention becomes addictive. Jealousy becomes easier to trigger. Ego conflicts become more common. External approval begins carrying far too much power because the underlying wound remains untreated. The universe offers both paths simultaneously. One leads toward authentic confidence. The other leads toward compensating for unresolved pain. The choice belongs to each individual. And what makes this sequence even more remarkable is how quickly the next chapter arrives. The cosmos does not wait long before asking whether the healing was genuine. Only 4 days after the square, on June 17th, Venus in Leo forms an exact opposition to Pluto in Aquarius. The lesson that began with the wound is about to encounter a powerful test, and what happens next will reveal whether the transformation truly took root beneath the surface. What happens after the wound is revealed may be even more important than the wound itself. Chiron's role is to bring hidden pain into awareness. But Pluto operates differently. Pluto does not focus on the injury. Pluto focuses on the systems built around the injury. It reveals the defenses, the survival strategies, the subtle emotional habits created to ensure that the same pain is never experienced again. This is why the opposition arriving on June 17th carries such profound significance. When Venus in Leo forms an exact opposition to Pluto in Aquarius, honesty becomes unavoidable. Not surface-level honesty, not the version of truth people tell others. This is the kind of truth that reaches directly into the unconscious and exposes motivations that have been operating behind the scenes for years. It highlights the places where fear still masquerades as wisdom. It reveals where control has replaced trust. It uncovers the quiet ways people attempt to manage love rather than experience it. Many individuals will begin recognizing patterns they have never fully acknowledged before. The tendency to overanalyze every interaction, the need to maintain emotional leverage, the habit of withdrawing before someone else has the opportunity to leave, the compulsion to appear unaffected when vulnerability feels dangerous. These behaviors often seem protective, yet beneath them sits a simple desire, the desire never to be hurt again. Pluto asks a difficult question. How much of your current behavior is actually serving your growth, and how much is merely protecting an old wound? The answer may be uncomfortable, but it is also liberating. Relationships built upon honesty, mutual respect, emotional maturity, and genuine healing will likely deepen during this period. Connections that have been strengthened through self-awareness may reach new levels of intimacy. Conversations become more meaningful. Trust becomes stronger. Emotional bonds become more authentic. However, relationships built upon avoidance often struggle under Pluto's influence. Dynamics based on hidden resentment, unspoken expectations, manipulation, emotional dependency, or unequal power structures may suddenly feel impossible to maintain. Situations where one person continuously sacrifices themselves while another benefits from the imbalance may begin showing visible cracks. Patterns that once remained hidden become impossible to ignore. This is not because the universe is punishing anyone. It is because truth naturally creates pressure wherever illusion still exists. Think of it as an inspection rather than a judgment. The healing initiated by the Venus-Chiron Square now faces a test. The question becomes whether genuine transformation occurred or whether appearances simply changed while the underlying issue remained untouched. It is one thing to rearrange circumstances. It is another thing entirely to heal the reason those circumstances existed in the first place. The cosmos is asking a simple but powerful question. Did you truly transform, or did you simply find a more sophisticated way to avoid the same lesson? Then comes another major turning point. June 19th marks the conclusion of an era that has influenced humanity since 2018. On this day, Chiron leaves Aries permanently. The significance of this transition cannot be overstated. For 8 years, Chiron has traveled through the sign associated with identity, individuality, personal courage, and the right to exist authentically. Throughout this long cycle, countless people have confronted painful questions regarding self-worth, belonging, confidence, purpose, and authenticity. Many have struggled with feelings of inadequacy. Many have questioned whether their voice mattered. Many have wrestled with the tension between fitting in and being true to themselves. Some have spent years trying to earn acceptance by becoming what others expected them to be. Others have fought exhausting battles simply to claim ownership of their own identity. Every insecurity, every crisis of confidence, every moment of wondering whether you were enough, every situation where you chose approval over authenticity, every experience that challenged your relationship with yourself has been part of this larger story. And now that story reaches its conclusion. The Venus-Chiron Square occurring on June 13th acts as the final chapter of that journey. It is the closing ceremony. It is the culmination of lessons that have been developing since 2018. It is the moment when everything learned during the Aries era comes into focus. But there is something important to understand. No cosmic event can force you to release an old identity. No planetary movement can remove a burden you insist on carrying. The war may be ending, but you must decide whether you are willing to put down the weapons. As Chiron enters Taurus, the collective emotional landscape begins changing dramatically. The focus shifts away from identity and toward embodiment. Away from proving, toward grounding, away from endless confrontation, toward stability. The year is characterized by constant defensiveness, emotional armor, performative strength, and perpetual struggle begin giving way to a different set of priorities. People will increasingly crave peace. They will crave simplicity. They will crave meaningful connection with reality. The desire for physical safety, financial security, emotional steadiness, and genuine presence will become more important than endless conflict. Yet Taurus introduces its own healing journey. New wounds emerge into awareness. Questions surrounding scarcity. Questions surrounding self-worth. Questions surrounding productivity and value. Questions regarding the growing disconnect between modern life and the physical body. Those lessons begin on June 19th. But until that transition occurs, the primary focus remains exactly where it has been all along: the heart. This is why the days leading up to June 13th matter so much. The anaretic degree does not encourage passivity. It asks for participation. It asks for conscious engagement. It asks you to choose. The first step is surprisingly simple. Stop resisting what you feel. Whatever emotions have been surfacing recently, whether sadness, longing, nostalgia, grief, disappointment, or uncertainty, stop treating them as enemies. Emotions are information. They are messages. They are invitations to awareness. Instead of pushing them away, sit with them. Observe them. Allow them to exist without immediately demanding explanations. Remember that feelings move through awareness. They are not awareness itself. You are not the sadness. You are not the grief. You are the consciousness observing the experience. And that distinction changes everything. The second step requires courage, radical honesty, not with other people first, with yourself. Examine the places where you may be compromising your truth. Examine the situations where you continuously betray your own needs to maintain someone else's comfort. Examine the relationships where you know something is misaligned, but continue pretending otherwise. The square between Cancer and Aries presents a powerful challenge. Can you remain connected to others without abandoning yourself? Can you maintain your individuality without constructing emotional walls? The goal is not perfection. The goal is authenticity. The third step is movement. The 29th degree represents culmination. It rewards action. If there is a conversation that has been delayed, address it. If there is a truth waiting to be spoken, express it. If there is a boundary that needs to be established, establish it. If there is a situation that has clearly reached its conclusion, acknowledge it. Aries energy heals through movement. Growth happens when action replaces avoidance. Remaining frozen inside the wound is no longer sufficient. Something must change. And despite the intensity of everything discussed so far, there is an extraordinary gift hidden within this entire process. The purpose of this transit is not suffering. The purpose is expansion. When someone consciously moves through a Venus-Chiron Square, allowing the experience to transform rather than harden them, something remarkable emerges. Compassion deepens. Understanding expands. Emotional wisdom becomes embodied rather than theoretical. You begin recognizing beauty where others only see damage. You develop the ability to sit with another person's pain without becoming overwhelmed because you have learned how to sit with your own. The heart becomes larger, not because it avoided breaking, because it allowed itself to open. That is the true lesson Chiron has been teaching since 2018. Not how to avoid pain, not how to eliminate vulnerability, but how to transform suffering into wisdom, how to transform wounds into strength, how to transform experience into compassion. As this chapter comes to an end, as Chiron completes its final passage through Aries and Venus carries the last remnants of old emotional patterns into Leo's fire, take a moment to recognize how far you have already come. You are not the same person you were when this cycle began in 2018. You are not even the same person you were a few weeks ago. Growth has been happening whether you noticed it or not. Lessons have been integrating beneath the surface. Strength has been developing quietly. And by the time June 14th arrives, another layer of transformation will already be complete. One chapter closes. Another begins. Something is being released. Something new is preparing to emerge. And the heart that stands at the center of this transition, marked by experience, strengthened by healing, and opened by wisdom, may finally be ready for everything that comes next. Thank you for spending this time here and sharing this journey. If this message resonated with you, consider subscribing and becoming part of this growing community. I would love to hear your experiences and insights in the comments below. Until our next exploration together, take care of yourself, trust the process unfolding within you, and stay open to the transformations still waiting ahead.